So let's get the elephant in the room out of the way. Yes, I actually spent money to study Star Trek. Cyborg anthropology is a real degree. It started in the 80s. It came out of primatology. And studying how, what primates do in terms of tools brought up this question of what makes a human and how does our interaction with things and technology in all of its forms actually change us as much as we're changing the world. So my work has spanned all kinds of different things. Very briefly, I sit on the Accenture Technology Advisory Board to their CTO. I work with companies like yours. I do a lot of work with NTT Group, which is a huge telco out of Japan that most of you probably haven't heard of before, but maybe more than the average here in this room. And really, my work, no matter what format it's been in, and that of my team, is to help people shift their relationship to new technologies and technology in general from one of fear to one of purpose. Like, what are we actually building with this thing instead of how is this going to replace my job? So I'm not intended to be an expert in any one field, as we'll hear about in just a second. But one thing that I have found is that there are a couple key topics that are really helpful to understand before we drill into any one technology. And this big picture of how all these pieces connect is what I want to talk about for the first part. And then we're going to talk a bit about thinking styles and how that actually plays out in organizations that are trying to make a platform-based business play. But first of all, how many of you hold an engineering role here at Adtran? How many of you hold an engineering role and another kind of role? And how many of you do not hold an engineering role at all? Okay, great. So we've got about a third of the room that does not hold an engineering role, a little bit of crossover, and more than half the room that does hold an engineering role. Not a big surprise given where we are, but it's important to understand that for me so I kind of know where we're speaking to. Another question, how many of you have Internet of Things devices in your home? How many of you have multiple systems of Internet of Things devices in your home that are connecting, like different brands and things like that? So a little less. And how many of you have friends or whoever else who, well, how do I put this? For how many of you are all of your friends also having a lot of IoT stuff in their house? Like not that many, right? So this is the situation that happens for a lot of us, right? We're in the tech industry, we're in the sector, we're used to tinkering and making stuff happen. But the rest of the world, even if they do have the money and access or even the interest, is not necessarily adopting these technologies. And sometimes it's because they weren't designed with them in mind. And so our work is often to help people figure out how do you connect all those dots. So I'm going to talk about multi-sided platforms today, and I'll define that in a second. And then we'll talk about the thinking styles that go with them. Very briefly, causit.org is our website. All of the content I'm presenting today is available online. And then, also, please go ahead and go on the site anytime you want. We have question and answer kind of chatbot. And I'll actually look at the chatbot at the end of the day today to make sure that any of the questions you all pose get answered quickly. So I was standing in an intersection in London, and this guy runs across the street, and, like most people do, bye, hey, whatever, and then starts to run across here. He's timed it right. You'll notice the first car hit its brakes briefly, and the second car didn't hit its brakes at all. That one piece of information, you could say that one bit of information for however long it had a duration, was how the car in front told the car in back that something was happening. And then the person in each of those cars only has whatever field of view they have. So when we start to think about the Internet of Things, what we're really thinking about a lot of times is a social network of things. How do you get security cameras and whatever the heck is floating up there at the top, and the traffic signals and the cameras built into cars, how do you get them to all talk to each other? And just like we have social networks like Facebook where we say, hey, I trust this person to get more information than the general public who may get nothing or maybe just a little bit. There's these systems that we need to develop of trust and relationship between devices. And why is that? Because the second car there, a human being may not have time to slam on the brakes. They may not have the reaction time possible. So it's not just, it'd be cool if they drove themselves, but also there's ways of seeing the world that we can't do as human beings that require machines to negotiate and make decisions without human intervention. So that piece is a really important part of why IoT, for example, does or doesn't get adopted, or why autonomous cars do or don't get traction right now. So I'm going to show a little video that is kind of the one way we can handle this. So I think they get the award for cheesiest theme music of all time. And also, I love this because it shows a very low-tech solution to what could have been made into a high-tech problem. We could have tried to install smart crosswalks and text-to-speech and notifying people's phones and smart devices and telling them when it's safe to pass, or just taking whole sections of the street and saying they're only for autonomous vehicles. But there's an in-between state. And how to make that transition from the no tech is in place to the people see a case for developing all of this complexity to actually having that complexity, that through line is what business people have to deal with all the time, and we often struggle with it. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that platform is that connects all of these different devices. What does that look like as a business model and as a business structure? And then we're also going to talk about those thinking styles that help us get there. But first, here's kind of the next level of this about what we could do with IoT.
There's something you should know. Your toaster has a burning desire to talk to your espresso machine, but something doesn't translate. They need ... the universal language for smart things everywhere. See, right now, the smart stuff in your life is busy learning your language. But to really deliver the breakfast, they need to talk amongst themselves. Because when they do, everything gets better. Shoppers can buy what they want and know it'll ... Manufacturers can rest assured it's ... and done. And developers can find new ways for all kinds of objects to ... Transforming the way we play, work, and live. Look for ... by Zigbee Alliance, coming soon.
So, we want to make this big platform play and get all these different pieces connected. Now, don't get me wrong. I know there's a lot of players for IoT, and not everyone loves Zigbee. And also, that's drastically oversimplified, because that's what people who aren't engineers often want to hear around how tech works. And we all know it's a little more complex than that. So, you look at Apple or Nest, and how these systems work is by having some central party like Apple or Google do some heavy lifting around the software development kits, the hardware development kits, the APIs, and then making a basic kind of lingua franca for software developers who are smaller to be able to participate in that, or hardware developers in the case of IoT. So, you don't necessarily want to ask every developer that works on your system to develop their own sign-in system. But you also don't necessarily want all of them to try and develop their own security systems, because then you have 10,000 different devices out there on the market, none of which talk to each other and all of which have out-of-date firmware. So when we look at how all these pieces connect, there's this other approach to doing this, which is more around the concept of a central platform that is shared. But there's a question here about what the business model is. So, Thread and Wi-Fi, Google's consortium that they put together with lots of different groups has come up with Thread as a network transfer protocol to bridge mesh networks and sequential kind of daisy chain style networks with a Wi-Fi network with other proprietary networks. And they did this because they realized there needed to be some combination of how these pieces fit. Brillo, which is one of the things they're developing, is kind of this miniature Android OS. Weave is the API and SDK. And then you have Thread as the network protocol. Well, most of us don't want to deal with this in our house, right? Even if we do have the skills, it's still kind of annoying to deal with. So their idea was, how do you create the building blocks that other people can work with? Automatic is another example of this. Any of you know what that little device is over here? A couple hands. You ever had your car been brought in for emission testing? And they're like doing the smog check on your car to make sure that it's not out of date? Or that you go to the mechanic and try and figure out what that check engine light is? Yeah, onboard diagnostic port. The guy in the front had it. Onboard diagnostic port is a little port that's super simple data set that's been in most cars in the US since about '96. And so what this company said is, well, there's all these connected cars out there that are being sold on the basis of having fancy trip computers, basically. Why don't we go ahead and plug in this device and feed that data into a smartphone that can be a really good trip computer? You can track where you are, what your location is. So first of all, they built on someone else's platform. They built on the platform from CAN bus. They built on another platform, or in this case, multi-sided platform of the smartphone ecosystem in the app stores. In fact, their entire business wouldn't work without the smartphone approach to doing business, basically. But it gets really cool when you start to enable third-party value on top of it. So you can do more than just track what distance you have or how much before empty. You can plug in these other apps. So you can get an app for Concur or Expensify so that your drives for work actually get reimbursed to you like you would any normal expense report, but you don't have to file it. It's just done all automatically because it knows when you're driving, it knows when you're not, connects to your calendar, connects to your Expensify account, all of it's handled. You want to know, what kind of performance your engine's giving you, you can get that. Or my favorite one is Unmooch. How many of you tried to get gas money from friends in high school or college when you drove a car? Yeah, so Unmooch does that for you. And your friends log into it, you log into it, and then you all never think about it again, and it automatically charges them per mile when you're in the car, when they're in your car. And it splits if there's 5 friends in the car, it splits it 5 ways, and if there aren't, it splits it 1 way, And that's such a cool little thing. It's like Lyft for your own car. You're not trying to be a Lyft driver or an Uber driver, but the same concept is there. Wouldn't make sense to develop a whole ecosystem just to do that. But because you can build these apps on top of it, there's more that you can do. So multi-sided platforms is this concept. So traditionally, when we think of platforms, we think of infrastructure. We're talking about data, institutions, a user base, and then over time it got more complex. We had more data, more users, more institutions, but it was still kind of the same building blocks. This might be you're a Novell company in the old days, or you're a Microsoft company, or whatever your standards were, but you couldn't really go outside that platform. They were closed to other systems, proprietary, difficult for users to access. And the key here is, right now in the business world, there's all this conversation around digital business, these new mindsets and new business models. The mindset of platforms originally was about streamlining traditional business functions, industrial age business functions. It was IT streamlining. It's really important. It's supposed to reduce cost centers and improve efficiency, and it certainly does, or we wouldn't have so many of the businesses out there that we have today. But originally, the value was limited to this kind of linear analog mindset of pipes. How many products can we put through the pipeline and get out to market? Or how many bits can we get through the pipe? Or something along those lines. You're shipping something or sending something through. Traditional pipes often were about streamlining sales, but they didn't generate new business. They're a cost center, and they required the hosts of these platforms to conceive of, design, and deliver all the value to the customer. So what I mean by that is, if you buy a car, someone designed that car, maybe they checked in with customers along the way, but they designed the car, but once it's shipped, it doesn't change in function after it's shipped. It's a set and forget. You put it through the pipeline, it's out the other end of the pipeline, and the business goal is to wait for that car to become obsolete or find new customers and put them through the pipeline. And maybe there's some service and support at the end, but it's not about adapting. So Lynk & Co., not to be confused with Lincoln Motor Company, and literally no affiliation at all, is an offshoot of a company called Geely. You get like 17 brownie points if you know who Geely is. Anyone? Okay. Geely is the Chinese company that owns Volvo now. So what they did is they said, look, there's, 1 billion people in China that don't have cars, more or less, because very few cars are actually owned there, even though the market's exploding, it's still new. And it's not going to work to build 1 billion new cars. Like, there's just not capacity in the world to do that for all the reasons. So what they did is said, how do we build a car that is shareable, right? So people want the luxury features, they want the status symbol, they want the safety features, they want the efficiency. If you want to increase individual buying power, you can do kind of one route, which is make a really cheap car, or you can go the other route, which is, make Uber the mindset. In China, it's called Didi, and it's really, really effective. Or you can increase individual buying power by providing a vehicle that is used by multiple people. And so we don't really have a model like that here other than maybe Zipcar or one of these, paid by the hour services. What this is a platform that's designed to allow you to buy a car with your friends. You can co-buy it or an individual can buy it. You can share it with other people, set hours for when it can be shared, like while you're at work, that car could be being in use. You can make money from that. You can have packages delivered to it. But more importantly, they built it on a platform that allows other people to create apps on it for use cases they couldn't imagine as designers. And that there's a way to continually upgrade the value of the car by providing a platform through which other people can actually develop and sell apps. So there's a distribution channel and a whole bunch of other pieces. So when you go to look at how to build all of these pieces in a way that they can connect a group of users, a car that's semi-autonomous, with therefore a lot of technical complexity, maybe some really low-tech stuff like bike rental, your Nest thermostat kind of in the middle. How do you actually build that? Well, first of all, let's look at the mindset. So mindsets for platforms are usually about closed systems and data until proven otherwise, right? It's about purpose for the devices or components you build to be relatively isolated, right? So the purpose for a car is to be a car. It's not to also be a data center and a battery and all these other things. So the purpose for the device has to be pretty valuable or people aren't going to pay for it, which means that you're building all of the value around that car in-house. But when you look further out and you look at these other mindsets, they're actually enabling value by third parties. They make it in the long run. That's why your Kindle is really cheap or your iPhone is subsidized. And the infrastructure there is a cost center in the traditional mode. But so we want to look at a different way that it goes the other end of those spectrums. So when you look at these multi-sided platforms, what you're dealing with is a lot of complexity. Not all the blue boxes, there's a lot of other boxes, as it were. And there's lots of players. You've got brokers for various pieces of data. You've got vehicles, maybe utilities, a smart grid, the manufacturers. All of these different pieces have to fit together. And one route is to try and control all of it, but this other route is the Apple or Google route to creating multi-sided platforms. This is where multiple people can create value on top of it. I keep saying that over and over because I really mean it. But this piece that we look at here, there's a layer that's different that we're not used to thinking through in the same way. So most of us, when we talk about platforms, we mean infrastructure layer, right? We mean APIs, we mean the pipes of the platform that we've been talking about. But there's also obviously now this data layer, there's the big data play and all the things that go with that. But the community and marketplace piece is not usually developed in the same conversation as the technology. So if you think about it, we're not usually developing for an open platform that lots of people can build value on top of. We're not usually developing with the communities of users super in mind as we're doing this from the context of, we might have our software developers, we might have our hardware developers, all that. So when we look at organizing a company around being able not just to manage the APIs and the security and the data layer, but to also develop developer ecosystems and brand partnerships, blank as a service business models, end user communities around how everything is being used, there's a lot of skill sets that need to be more deeply integrated. I was just talking to your CEO today, and that's a huge interest for you all, obviously, because you have your Mosaic platform, and there's this work of activating all of these developer and partner communities and building all of the lateral links that need to be there. So what makes these distinct is that unlike traditional platforms, an MSP isn't focused on the pipes, it's focused on enabling value by third parties. And what that means is that the systems and people who are enabling new value have to focus on not how to get more things out the pipe, but how to connect more devices, more data sets, more sets of users. So unlike a traditional platform, there's that community and marketplace layer. It enables third-party value, and it gets more valuable to users the more they use it. So what if your car appreciated instead of depreciated? I mean, that's kind of an unrealistic example here, but we always think of buying something and then it drops off in value. But when you buy a smartphone, it gets more valuable with time because more apps are out there. Now, we do still replace them, but the value to the user is exponentially more than it would be if they bought something that just depreciated off the lot. So the piece that we want to look here is that the multi-sided platform host has a key job to reduce the friction of interactions on your platform. When we think about that and all the different partners that are here, you've got social and CRM and your business stakeholders, you've got all of your infrastructure layers around the tech side of things, but you also have your partners communities and your end users communities and the developer ecosystems that go with this, and then all the different data sets and all the partners you get that through. The complexity gets really, really high. So why I actually came here today that I'm most excited about is actually to talk about the thinking styles that connect all of these different pieces as you're looking at if it's time to build, buy, or partner for each of these sections. But before I move forward into this stuff around thinking styles where everyone gets to say, I'm an explorer, or whatever else that comes up for you, I want to see if there's any quick questions that I can take about this whole platform concept. They can range from how do you know this isn't BS to how do you actually build one, whatever you want. But are there questions or pushback or curiosity around this whole multi-sided platform model? So the question is, if you're developing a multi-sided platform, what's the advantage for the platform host? And the key here is host. It's not someone who's developing a platform and giving away control. That's one way to look at it. I got that question earlier today. Really what the job is of the platform is to make value possible, and then you get paid for making that value possible. So, for example, the majority of income from Apple and Google that are doing this stuff around smartphones isn't from the device sale. It's from all the app makers and the money they make off of that. The licensure off the content, the licensure cost for the app store and your membership in it, and the percentages that get charged, that's how they make money, because that's where the value is exponentially higher for the users and people are willing to pay those fractional prices for these apps. So that's the short answer of it. Next question. One way that people deal with this is that there's this chicken egg issue, right? So do I have to pay people to come on the platform in the beginning? Are they coming to me because I'm so attractive as a platform, et cetera? So the transition is really difficult for a lot of companies. Apple kind of set a precedent for it. So Apple didn't start by trying to go to every software developer out there in the world. They actually started their platform play with the music. So they went to the music labels, they went to the big players who wanted to feel like there was some light at the end of the tunnel for music sales in the age of Napster. And they went to the small labels who needed a way to get out from under the thumb of the monopolies that were happening in the big side of the industry. So they chose a very specific place and they put an unprecedented amount of work into coalition building there. They really listened to what people needed and they looked at the trade-offs that were there. They looked at what the users really wanted at the end of the day. And then they built the minimum of infrastructure necessary to make that viable. iTunes and the iPod. If you didn't have iTunes and the iPod, buying music online was a little harder. But you could still have this bridge product of buying music online from iTunes and ripping or burning it to a CD. That was an interim state. So technically, as a user, there was almost no cost to play with the ecosystem. You only paid when you actually got music, which is when you got value. On the music record or the label side, there wasn't much downside. The likelihood was not that people were going to buy music that they got paid for better elsewhere. The likelihood was just they weren't going to pay for music. So they chose an area where there was a big opportunity to erase an existing problem for the record labels, the big players, and to create a great gain for people who wanted to get good music but didn't want to break the law or deal with the annoyances of imperfect MP3s off the internet. Any other questions or follow-up? Okay, cool. Well, in order to build this kind of system within an organization and to make this transition from a business model perspective, it's not that you're letting go of product development. It's not that you're letting go of traditional platforms. You're adding an additional piece, which is this ability for third parties to create value on top of what you're doing, not at the erasure of your old product line or your old platform approach, which is probably quite viable still for anyone who's going into these things. So when we look at this, the question is really, what kinds of people need to be in the organization for this to work? And the answer is kind of, duh, everyone. But the amount of collaboration that has to happen in organizations that are building these platforms is much higher across different kinds of thinking. So if you think about Google or Apple, I'm using those examples because everyone's somewhat familiar with them, not because they're the only examples out there. They've got everyone from designers to political affairs people to software developers all talking to each other on a regular basis. The life cycle of product design and iteration and regulatory issues and response to the marketplace is very fast, so they need to have more integration of the kinds of thinking. So I want to talk a little bit about the thinking styles piece here that my colleague Mark Bonchek developed. And how many of you took the quiz before you came? Wow, thank you. Most people are like, eh. But it's a pretty short quiz. But I think the cool thing about this model is you don't actually have to take the quiz at all to get usually a quick gut check on what your best thinking style is. For some people, it's the explorer. We have experts. There's a lot of those in this room. I'm going to talk about the definitions for all these in a minute. We've got planners who are looking at the bigger picture of things, optimizers who are tweaking the small side of things to make the best efficiency possible, the best sound in this case. Energizers who are trying to make everything happen and motivate, those of us who need some motivation, but also to set a clear path. Producers who are the doing people. They just want to check it off the list and get everything done. The coaches who are helping people at an individual level cultivate capacity and potential. And the connectors who are functioning at the big picture level to connect the dots in a larger network of people. So this is a quiz. If you want to take it right now, that's fine. I won't be offended if you're looking on your phone. But this thinking styles quiz, the idea is to look at which of these thinking styles is best for you. So the big picture side of things, we've got the explorers, the planners, the energizers, the connectors. And these folks, they're looking really at what is the big picture. So no matter which angle they're at, they're looking at the big picture element of it. And then down here, we have the details orientation. So the first one was big picture orientation, they got details. And they're focusing on either ideas, so for the expert, the optimizer, producer, or coach, they're focusing on ideas, process, action, or relationships. So if you think about, am I a big picture person, am I more detail oriented, and where's the place that I go to get leverage to make something happen? Is it smarts about a key idea? Is it about the way we do things? Is it about just friggin' do it? Or is it about, I gotta talk to everyone about how they feel about this and what they need, because my work is focused around the relationships and I create value through others. So how many of you, when you take a quick look at this, feel like you identify with one particular style? Okay. Some people have a clear vibe on it. This thing is not intended to put anyone in a box. This isn't I am an ENFJ if you've ever done the Myers-Briggs kind of thing. That's about personality. These are about the ways you could create value in an organization. And all of us have more than one. It's just kind of about ranking it. So let's look at this. Explorer thinking is about generating creative ideas. They're about looking at the big picture and seeing what's possible. So that again, over there on the right, there's the ideas orientation. That's kind of the reminder. And if you go to the more detailed side of that, expert thinking is about achieving objectivity and insight. So a lot of times engineers self-identify with this. If not, your job's probably really hard. And those are the people you want to help them find a new way during the internship program. And then up here on the process side, this is also a place a lot of engineers show up, is this thinking about designing effective systems from the big picture level, right? So that's a piece around how are we going to launch a product? How are we going to set up architecture for this? And their counterparts on the more detailed side are the optimizers who are thinking about improving productivity and efficiency. So they're like, if we use this transport architecture, we're going to get much better throughput than this other one. The energizers out there, they're looking to motivate and mobilize people into action. So politicians often fall into this realm. If you've ever seen a politician, you're like, there's just no electricity there. That's usually because they're not actually an energizer. It's a rarity, because you usually need that to get elected. Stereotypically, CEOs are often this, but if you have a technical founder of a startup, they may not be. And that's actually one of the biggest issues when startups are getting going, is they have a technical founder who doesn't have the people focus. They're not as interested in getting people going. They're more focused on the quality of the technology. And that's a huge challenge for a lot of Silicon Valley companies that are getting going. Their counterpart on the individual level is about producer thinking. These are people who are all about achieving completion and momentum. The best admins in the world, they're these people. They're making sure all the checks get checked. So I'll talk about the example on my team in a minute here just to ground it in some reality. The connector piece is about people who are about building and strengthening relationships. So this is the HR folks sometimes, but not always. It definitely should be your salespeople and your partner developers. And they're all about doing this at a big picture level, where their counterparts, the coach, are thinking about cultivating people and potential on an individual level. So this is going to be someone who's training you or in some other way working with you one-on-one. They're across the table instead of across the room. So the question is, what's your style? So now I'm going to ask, how many of you think or identify with Explorer as your strongest? Okay. How many with Planner? Fewer. Energizer? Good. You got to have a couple of them here. Connector? All right. How many of you, and this is the easy one here, how many of you identify as expert? All right, so you're all about achieving objectivity and insight. How many of you identify as optimizers? One or two? Okay. That's a little bit of a surprise to me because usually in engineering groups we get a lot more optimizers, but you know, it's just shades of gray sometimes in this. And then how many of you identify as producers? Like what brings you deep satisfaction in life is getting things done? All right, and coach. All right, not a lot of those in the room. That's totally fine. You're probably in high demand for helping people out. So when we look at this at the group scale, there's a lot of questions about how do you deal with ranking who should be in the group in terms of different phases of a project, that sort of thing. But I'm going to talk about the gray area, right? Because there's some hesitation to say this is the one style I am. So I think about it as the ones where you need support. These are where you put $100 of effort in and you get $1 back. So for example, for me, it's all about optimizer, or actually not even optimizer, but more like the producer stuff. If I just have to sit and do the same thing over and over, it drives me nuts. But I'm like $10 in, $10 out when it comes to the planner part. Do a decent job of planning stuff and seeing the big picture. I'm not necessarily the one that's going to do every single step in that, but seeing how all the pieces fit together, it's decent, but I shouldn't be a project manager for a living because I put about the same amount of effort in that I get out. And my value to a team or my organization isn't going to be as strong as if that were like my #1 kind of thing, my genius zone area. So the genius zone or native zone for yourself is where you put $1 in and you get $100 out. So this is the best place to focus your job or work on because it's going to be the place that will feel the least effortful to you. And this is sometimes the gray area because we think of our value at work usually being about areas where we work hard. We wear a badge of honor about how many hours we worked and how difficult it was. But actually that's usually because those are areas where either because of our team setup or who we are individually, we're actually not doing work that's easy and it's not all that efficient. So for me, my end of this thing that I really love, I love the explorer stuff, I love expert idea stuff, although I don't want to focus on any one idea, which leads me more towards the explorer. I love coaching and connecting with people. And like I said, I like planning sometimes. It's still I would say it's competent area. But the challenge is for me, this optimizer producer stuff where I'm twiddling the knobs and getting it dialed in just right. I have a home theater system at home that I've never set up because I don't want to calibrate all the levels for the different speakers in the back, right? Like I have a Wi-Fi repeater, but I don't want to deal with it because I know I'm going to have to twiddle with it to get the latency right. I have like multi-speaker sound system. Like I have these tech gadgets and the real measure of if I'm going to use them or not is if I'm going to have to tweak them. On my team, my colleague Kelly, who is our operations manager, she's all about producer and planner. She's all about getting it done. So she reminds me that she sent a check to someone today or a certain thing happened in the CRM. She's planning how all the pieces fit together. She's optimizing our employee handbook, our finances, our accounting, all of that. She's coaching people about how to do a good job, right? But I wouldn't put her out on the market as a career coach, for example. She's good at it, but she's not excellent at it. And the areas where she needs support are more almost exactly inverse to what feels really strong for me. So we're a really good pair in running the business because she's complementing my thinking styles. The difference between these two, I'm not looking for another me in this situation. I'm looking for someone who can round out the thinking styles that I have. So when you put them to work, at every level of the organization, whether it's specific projects and tasks all the way up to big picture strategy, there's different kinds of thinking styles that tend to do the best work in that area. And part of what needs to happen when you're building multi-sided platforms in an organization is that you need more regular communication between people working on the strategy and the people working on the day-to-day tasks of the organization. Google, they change direction a lot more often than Microsoft did 20 years ago. And Microsoft changed direction a lot more often than, other companies in the marketplace generally did 20 years ago. So there's a relativity to this, that the more complex your systems get and the faster the market's changing, which is of course always a big issue in technology, the more there needs to be regular communication and some kind of optimizing of how all these pieces fit together. So we call this thought partnership. You've probably heard of thought leaders. They're annoying people who stand on stage and think they have the answers to everything. The thought partners are the people you sit across from at work and actually build things with. So I've done the thought leader thing. I don't really consider myself a thought leader, but I do work with other thought leader types out there in the world who are like TED speakers and things like that. And their job is to give a good idea out to the world that someone can go take and do something with. But a thought partner is about actually achieving, some kind of momentum in real life. And the thought partnership is supposed to be kind of reciprocal, right? It's not you're consuming something from the audience. It's that you're actually creating something with another person that you care about or are working with, or hopefully both. And there's basically two ways this shows up. The resonant thought partnership is where I say something and you're like, yeah, that's totally how I think about it too. And the resonant thought partners are pretty close to your worldview and your way of thinking. These are people who create capacity because they can also think through a problem with you the same way you would. Maybe they have a little bit different experience, but their way of thinking through it's the same. Whereas complementary thought partnership is all about rounding it out. So complementary thought partnership is going to be where, you have maybe a coach who comes in and is working with your engineering team to round out how, agile processes work within your organization. Or you might have an optimizer come into an innovation team so they can take something that innovation team has come up with and start to make it more realistic for the organization it's going to have to live in. So whether it's resonant or complementary, the idea is to look for where it's reciprocal, where you're creating value and you're receiving value. So resonant thought partnership, to recap, provides capacity, as with the idea of a sounding board resonating. And complementary thought partnership, so resonant would be like two explorers. Complementary thought partnership provides a catalyst, like a spark. So this is a lot of times the person who pushes your boundaries. It's the provocateur in the group. It's the rebel who's saying, screw this isn't the right way to set this up. And that's the kind of thought partnership that gets a lot of the news. I sat down with this really different kind of thinker and we came up with this new product. Or a doctor and an athlete came together and they figured out that people need better, athletic tape. I don't know. So those are the things that seem more newsworthy as a way. But the resonant piece is also important to cultivate, because if you have people who are like the only one who thinks that way on their team, like there's someone who raised their hand for coach, literally I think only one person, it's really hard for them. And that's where you see people go to the industry conferences or whatever else to find the other people from their tribe, as it were. So when we're talking about this, there's a couple ways to look at it. One is that there's day-to-day stuff that you're doing in your team, and I'm not going to belabor the point too much. But another is this thing around thought partnership habits. So one of the greatest ones out there that I think is the sharing habit. And it comes from also having kind of like an information diet. So if you're consuming new information, if you're learning new things out there on the web or at conferences, whatever else, how do you turn around and share that with other people on your team? And obviously we talk about it, and I'm not telling you, oh, talking's the way to do it. But actually, what I'm talking about is how do you, on a more regular basis, do that? So for sales teams, for example, they're using LinkedIn all the time. How do you find information that you can share with your clients that provides value to them? How do you curate that in the right way? How do you stay on point with that? How do you make sure that they know that you're someone they could come to with a question? Are any of you in here considered sales engineers? Anyone a sales engineer? So in the software world, it's a common term these days, and it's the idea of the engineer who specifically is there to support the sales team. And so this engineer is going to answer questions about integration, and they're going to answer questions about the what-ifs of everything. They're going to answer questions about compliance and standards. So this might be someone who isn't that producer type who wants to do the same thing day in and day out. They're probably more the planner, maybe the explorer, that's looking at how all the pieces fit together. The salesperson might be this connector. So they're putting these two pieces together. And the habits that might be there is the sales engineer might be looking for text that explains why a certain technology is important, they can forward on to their salespeople. The salesperson might forward something on to the sales engineer that says, hey, look, these are the top 10 questions asked by CIOs when they're selecting a new technology. And there are tools for this. There's knowledge tracking systems within organizations that people are using. One's called GetGuru, G-E-T-G-U-R-U. It's a little browser plugin, and whenever you start Googling for something at work, it tells you other people at work who are also regularly looking for and talking about that stuff. Not like creepy monitoring, but people can opt in and say, hey, I know about, really cute kitten videos. The other person will be like, hey, I need to know the newest cute kitten videos. And then a third person vouches that the first person actually knows about cute kitten videos. So that kind of cute kitten video system, also known as a knowledge management system, is a really cool way to do this that's lightweight. Some teams kind of have brown bag lunches and show and tells around this that are more analog tools. So whatever your tool set is for finding out information and sharing it, if you get everyone on some of the same basic tools for this, in our organization we use Slack a lot. We have a channel called Found, which is where we put articles out there in the world that are relevant to everyone. And then we have more topical channels like tech stack, operations, sales, marketing. And when something's more specific to those, we put it in there. It tends to also correlate to thinking style a bit. And there's that practice of what do you do regularly? So do you regularly go to conferences? Do you share outside the organization? Do you bring information in, like Larry and the rest of the team are doing here with bringing in talks from around the Huntsville area? How do you create a practice of learning and sharing regularly? And then the scale of it is the other question. At an organizational level, you also need to build these knowledge management systems, and you need to build that kind of system within the industry. It used to be that companies mostly talked about where they had a specific transaction or maybe around standards. But if you're building multi-sided platforms, you have to be regularly positioning yourself in a really changing landscape of lots of different developers and partners. They need to be signaled that you think a certain way about problems. So let's say you're a big data company and you're really keen on a certain kind of analytics, a really certain way of doing narrow AIs, and you have to make sure that you understand that properly. On the other side, there's someone who needs an analytic company, they need to know that. So that signaling and that partnership isn't just a marketing function, it's more about how do you build thought partnerships throughout the industry as well. So the whole idea here was to give some tools for people to think through what their own thinking styles are and to look at what's possible with combining different thinking styles in your team. So with that, you can go check it out on the website, but I would love to open it to any questions or feedback. All right, far side. So big picture thinkers usually correspond to leadership roles, but not always. So big picture people who are responsible for the vision of the organization usually need to be explorers who are generating creative ideas and energizers who are mobilizing people into action, right? So you're seeing generally big picture thinkers be in so-called leadership roles, and what I mean by that is roles which have power over other parts of the organization. In the broader sense of leadership, each and every thinking style is important because how you actually get things done involves, all of those different kinds of thinking. I would say that most CEOs in traditional Western style companies typically fall into those top 3 or so. But if you talk about companies in Japan, for example, where I do a lot of work, it's not uncommon to find an optimizer or a planner in a managing director role. They don't even call it CEO most of the time, it's managing director, because the mindset is fundamentally different about what provides value for setting the direction of the company. Yeah, so it happens a lot, actually. You'll see this, for example, if you have a whole bunch of surgeons in a room, they're probably thinking through surgery the same way. One of the reasons that organizations do residencies when it comes to medical is to get people exposed to lots of different environments, because the way you're a surgeon if you're an ear, nose, and throat doctor versus the surgeon if you're in an emergency room, they have something to learn from each other. But if you have an ear, nose, and throat problem, you probably want to go to a place that primarily is ear, nose, and throat doctors. Right, so there's times where work really benefits from a consistency. Those kind of maintenance programs of various sorts, those, like insurance companies with claims, whatever else, you want people who think through things a similar way on a regular basis, and you need to scale it. And it's easy to scale teams that think the same way for the most part. When you're trying to create something new or go through a big transition, you need that diversity of thinking, and you need to emphasize certain roles at certain times. So one of the articles that's on our site around thinking styles, on our Thinking Styles Hub there, is for each season of innovation, winter, spring, summer, fall, like I need to figure out what seeds I'm gonna plant. I'm planting some seeds, but I don't see anything coming through the ground yet. It's summertime, I gotta figure out which ones to cut back and which ones to water more. Or it's fall, and I'm harvesting and trying to get all the fruit off the tree. At each of those phases, there's different kinds of thinkers that are best to emphasize. 95% plus of companies that are out there that are big companies are hiring for people in the fall. They're hiring for people doing business as usual and getting all the fruit off the tree. You get a lot of optimizers, you get a lot of producers. But now companies are being asked to pivot their product direction and strategy every 6 months to a year or something, where it used to be 10 to 20-year product life cycles. You have to mix up what kind of season of innovation you hire for, and also that means you end up having to hire more diversity of thinking styles too. So a great example is if you go to a product design group, and it's typically all optimizers or engineers, right? So this happens in the automotive industry a lot. And then you bring in someone new, a big picture explorer type, who's maybe from a digital strategy team or a different part of the organization, from marketing. This happens a lot. You put together a new product team, and there's only one person thinking through the marketing side of things, which is connector. You're going to run into a lot of challenges there. So one of the simplest exercises is actually just identifying which people are which thinking styles. And the slightly more complex exercise is kind of trading hats. So there's some exercises out there in organizational development around this that have to do more with power. But in the thinking style sense, it's like, hey, I'm normally the one being loud about engineering related issues, but I'm going to try on being loud about connector issues this time around. So there's some simple stuff you can do with that. The other thing is getting clear about the process through which you're going to evaluate new ideas and existing ideas, so that people know when and where they can plug in and where different kinds of thinking are best contributed. This is why a lot of people are doing a lot these days about building innovation pipelines and innovation programs within organizations. So thinking styles is a relatively new model. It was developed by Elisa Steele, who's the CEO of Jive Software. It's an enterprise social network. And my colleague Mark Bonchek, who is a digital strategist. He writes for Harvard Business Review, lots of places. So it's a newer model. It's not like DISC or Myers-Briggs, which have been around for a long time, or even StrengthsFinder, which is not as long, but still been there a pretty long time. But all of those are really designed more for figuring out what your emotional or personality or power dynamic as it relates to leadership are. The thinking styles piece is a newer frame for how to look at this. We try to make it as simple as possible. So I can't give you a number around percentages of companies adopting. I will say that we've briefed major banks, automakers, telcos, things like that about how to apply this. Sometimes a good recruiter will be doing this intuitively, and HR groups often are doing this intuitively, but it isn't said out loud. So part of this is just to make that more obvious that we've experienced from being in all these different parts of organizations. So please share it. All right, thank you so much.